All right, everyone. Welcome to another season, another session of our VAMP, Vanderbilt Modern Philosophy Spring Seminars. As you know, we opened earlier in the month with a talk by Professor Wapping Luadler, contextualizing the historiography of the modern period in philosophy. But we now start with our regular series, and we start with a bang because we have a panel. We have Jason Yonover and Fanhao Meng, both from Princeton, that will explain and explore notions of law of nature across the modern period, including Descartes, Malebranche, Spinoza, and Nietzsche. So join me in welcoming them, and without further ado, for now, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen. One point. Okay. So can you all see it? Okay. Okay. So yeah, first we would like to thank our host for this fantastic opportunity, and it is really a great pleasure to be here to talk about the philosophers we are going to talk about. So I shall go first and say something about Descartes and Malebranche, and then Jason will take over and discuss Spinoza and Nietzsche. So, so as you can see on my title, I'm going to say something about the relationship between God and laws of nature as we find it in Descartes and Malebranche. And unsurprisingly, both these philosophers endorse a very close connection between the two, between God and laws of nature. But I shall argue that there is a very fundamental difference between their ways to conceive the connection. And from this fundamental difference, there also follows many consequences for their respective systems. So that's the main point. And here is my plan today. So first, there are some necessary preliminaries, but after that, I will first present and explain the fundamental difference I have just mentioned. And then after that, I will explore three of the consequences this fundamental difference has for the two philosophers. One is in metaphysics, one in scientific methodology, and one in natural philosophy proper. So let's begin with the preliminaries. So the very first thing I want to clarify is what I mean by the term law of nature. Of course, this is very important because this term can be used in very different senses. So in many cases, when we talk about laws of nature, we are talking about some laws that tell us or are supposed to tell us how our world works. So for example, Newton's three laws of motion and his law of gravity belong to this kind. But sometimes we can also use this term, I think, to refer to something very different, namely certain moral or normative rules that tell us what we should or should not do, and which are considered as natural rather than prescribed by some human being. So, for example, we have Hobbes' natural laws, or he also calls them laws of nature sometimes, and so Descartes, as far as I know, uses this term law of nature only in the first and the factual sense, and that's the sense in which I'm going to talk about laws of nature today. And also here is some information about the two philosophers' connection with laws of nature. So as is well known, Descartes introduced three laws of nature in his Principles of Philosophy and also in his earlier but unpublished work, Le Monde or the World. So roughly speaking, the first law tells us that all bodies tend to remain in its parent state, whether it's in motion or it's at rest. And the second law says that all bodies tend to move in a straight line. And the third law tells us in a very general way what happens when two bodies collide with each other or something like that. Okay, so these are Descartes' basic laws of nature, and these laws are very influential. And now, Malebranche, of course, is a very important Cartesian, so to speak, and he is heavily influenced by Descartes, and particularly, Malebranche inherited the term and the very basic notion of laws of nature from Descartes, and also I think the very idea that nature is governed by God in accordance with certain general laws is very prominent in Malebranche's philosophy, and also this idea is actually closely connected with his kernalism. So I think given this connection between the two philosophers, it would be very interesting to have a look at their ways to conceive the laws of nature, and this is what I'm going to do today. So let me present and explain the fundamental difference, which is the focus of my whole paper. Of course, usually I would be expected to follow the chronological order and begin with Descartes, but today I'm not going to do that. So I will begin with Malebranche and then come back to Descartes. And the reason why I do this is I think the conception of Malebranche is really the easier to grasp and the more natural one in a sense. But the conception of Descartes is indeed a bit elusive, and it is best illustrated when set in contrast with Malebranche's conception. Okay, so as you can see, here is Malebranche's conception on the slide. So for him, the laws of nature are the will of God, or to be more precise, they are volitional contents of God. And I think Malebranche is quite explicit about this in his work. So for example, on the in the first quotation on my slide, it says something like God willed certain laws according to which motion is communicated upon the collision of bodies. So these laws are what God wills. And also, God wills these laws of nature in the particular sense that he voluntarily chose them when creating the world. So this is what he says in the very first sentence of the second quotation here. So as for the natural laws of motion, God chose the simplest. And I think this way to conceive the connection between God and laws of nature can be called voluntary choice conception. And I said this conception is really the more natural one, because I think if there is some law, it is quite natural for us to suppose a lawgiver who had laid down this law. And also, the law prescribed by a lawgiver may be plausibly thought as lawgiver's will, or the expression of the lawgiver's will. And if this is accepted, and I think it is kind of natural to accept this package of thought, then it becomes very natural for us to think that the laws of nature are prescribed by God, and God is really the lawgiver of the laws of nature. And in fact, I think this way to conceive laws of nature is so natural that people sometimes attribute it to Descartes as well. So for example, Walter Alt, in his book on causation and laws of nature in early modern philosophy, he claims that the Cartesian laws of nature are arbitrary in the sense that they directly depend on the will of God. And also, he explicitly assimilates Descartes' conception to that of Malebranche. But I think if we really go to what Descartes really says about laws of nature, we'll realize that he has something very different in his mind. So as we have mentioned, Descartes presents his laws of nature twice, once in his Principles of Philosophy and once in his The World. But in neither of these two works does he ever mention God's will when he talks about his laws of nature. And in fact, he doesn't even use the word will or volition once in either of these two texts. And instead, he says something like the laws of nature follow manifestly from the sole fact that God is immutable. So that is to say, for him, the laws of nature are really necessary consequences following from God's immutability. And I'd like to add that these laws of nature follow from God's immutability, just like geometrical theorems follow from axioms. And I think this is what I will call the necessary consequence conception of the laws of nature. Immediately, there might be an objection to my understanding of Descartes. So as it is well known, Descartes has this very famous doctrine of the creation of the eternal truth. So according to which the certain truths that we think as necessary and eternal, like mathematical truths, are really created by God, and they are really volitional contents of God. And so so people might think that this doctrine implies that the laws of nature are also subject to God's voluntary choice. And of course, the underlying thought here is like the laws of nature themselves are also eternal truths. So my reply to this kind of objection is just that the laws of nature are really not eternal truths for Descartes. So I know taking laws of nature as a subclass of eternal truths is quite common among Descartes scholars, and many people have said things that amounts to this position. But there are also people like Pavlich and Garber who have argued that this is really a misunderstanding of Descartes, and in fact, for Descartes, the laws of nature are not eternal truths. And of course, I side with these latter people, but since this is not the main focus of my talk today, I will just briefly mention two considerations which support my view here. So first, at least to my knowledge, Descartes never explicitly says that his laws of nature belong to the class of eternal truths. And of course, there are certain indirect textual evidence which has been cited by supporters of the opposite view. But I think if we take those texts and put them back to their proper context, they don't really commit us to the, they don't really commit Descartes to the view that laws of nature are the eternal truths. But more importantly, I think the laws of nature simply don't belong to the kind of truths that are standardly called eternal truths by Descartes. Because according to Descartes, eternal truths are the truths about the essences of created things, as he says in this letter cited here to Mersenne. But the laws of nature are not just like that, so they are not truths about the essences of created things. So supposedly, the laws of nature are truths about motion, but they don't tell us what motion is, and they are not about things that follows directly from the essence of motion. And so this is what I think, and I think the laws of nature are not eternal truths for Descartes, so the objection I have just mentioned really rests on a mistake. But I have to admit this is an issue of controversy, and I guess Jason will also touch upon this a bit in his talk, and we can definitely have more discussions on this later. But now let's move on to the consequences. And a first consequence can be found in metaphysics, and it is about which divine attributes ground laws of nature. So as I have already mentioned, for Descartes, the laws of nature are grounded solely in God's immutability. That is to say, he only takes this one divine attribute, namely immutability, as the ground of the laws of nature. But Malebranche accepted this basic idea, namely that the laws of nature are grounded in divine attributes. But besides immutability, he also introduced something different, namely God's wisdom, which is not in Descartes at all. So for example, here, in this quotation, he discusses the reason why God must act through general laws. And one reason for this is just that this way of acting, namely acting through general laws, bears the marks of wisdom and divine and immutable divinity. So here, wisdom and immutability are taken together as a ground of laws of nature. But one might ask, how does this work? How does divine wisdom ground the laws of nature? And here we need to introduce a doctrine endorsed by Malebranche, which is sometimes called the simplicity of the ways of God. So according to Malebranche, wisdom is measured not only by the work itself of some agent, but also by the means by which this work is completed. So a wise being must best balance the simplicity of the means on the one hand and the excellence of the work itself on the other hand. And since God is supremely wise, of course, God must also act in this way. And therefore, this is what he says. God must determine himself to create that world which could have been produced and preserved by the simplest laws, and which ought to be the most perfect in respect to the simplicity of the ways necessary to its production or to its conservation. So in a word, God's wisdom requires that he produces the world in a way that best balances the simplicity of his act and the perfection of the world itself. And this requirement guides his choice of the laws of nature and the word following from these laws of nature. And this entire line of thought obviously presupposes voluntary choice conception as I have illustrated before, because the role of divine wisdom here is to guide the choice of laws of nature. And this makes sense only if the laws of nature are subject to voluntary choice in the first place. And also, I think once this is understood, it is quite easy to also understand why Descartes didn't mention divine wisdom in his treatment of laws of nature at all. It is because if the role of divine wisdom is to guide the God's voluntary choice, and this role really presupposes a voluntary choice conception, then Descartes really has every reason to avoid bringing wisdom in, because he has a totally different conception of the laws of nature. So this is the first consequence. And second consequence is in scientific methodology. Now, I think the two philosophers' different conceptions of the laws of nature also makes them have very different attitudes towards the role of experience in scientific investigations, and particularly the role of experience in scientific inquiries into the contents of the laws of nature. So for Descartes, the laws of nature are and should be deduced a priori from the first cause of motion, namely God, and experience plays no decisive role in determining the contents of the laws of nature. Of course, I mean, Descartes has a very dismissive attitude towards the role of experience in this enterprise. Now, here is what he says in the word. But even if everything our senses ever experienced in the actual world seemed manifestly contrary to what is contained in these two rules, the reasoning that has taught me them seems so strong that I cannot help believing myself obliged to suppose them in the new words that I'm describing to you. But what more firm and solid foundation could one find to establish a truth, even if one wished to choose it at will, than the very firmness and immutability which is in God? So he has two messages to convey here, I think. So first, his laws of nature are really based on the firmness and the immutability which is in God. And also, such laws of nature derived a priori from God's immutability can contradict our experience. But if this ever happens, it is really the experience itself that is to be blamed. So experience is really not that important in a sense. Now, Malebranche has a very different attitude towards experience, which is much more positive. So for him, experience is kind of indispensable to the inquiry into the contents of the laws of nature. And I think this is best illustrated in the following text, which comes from a remark on the conservation principle. So here is what he says. Certainly in this case, one can discover the truth only by experience. But as we can't grasp the designs of the creator, now comprehend all the relations they have to their attributes, this issue, i.e. to conserve or not to conserve an equal absolute quantity of motion in the universe, appears to depend on a purely arbitrary volition of God, of which in consequence we can be sure only by a kind of revelation, such as that which experience gives. So the idea here is this: since the laws of nature are God's will, and since we as finite beings cannot fully grasp what God thinks, then there is no way for us to deduce these laws a priori from its true origin, namely God's will. And the only way left for us is to go to the experience and try to extract the laws of nature from the phenomena they really govern. And here, his attitude is quite positive, and it is in clear contrast with Descartes' attitude. So this is what I have to say about the second consequence. And the third and final one is found in natural philosophy proper, and it is about a very specific physical question, namely, does body at rest have a force to resist motion? And Descartes and Malebranche disagree with each other on this issue. So Descartes thinks that a body at rest does have a certain power or force to resist being moved when it is impacted by another body in motion. And the result is that a body A at rest can never be moved by a body B in motion if B is smaller than A. And for Descartes, this consequence just follows from his first law of nature. But Malebranche rejected this opinion together with Descartes' first law. So for Malebranche, the state of rest has no force for resisting the force of motion. So this is what he says in the Search of Truth. And also the result is if a body A is in motion and a body B is at rest, then this body A will always be able to set body B in motion when they collide with each other. This is quite different from what Descartes thinks. Now, I think the important thing is if we look at Malebranche's critique of Descartes, and if we look at his argument, then we will say that his critical argument against Descartes' first law is really based on a conception of laws of nature as the will of God. But as we have already mentioned, this way to conceive the laws of nature is quite different from how Descartes himself conceived this law. So I'm afraid we don't have enough time to dive into the details of this argument, but the general idea is like this. So according to Malebranche, laws of nature and supposedly including Descartes' first law, they are all God's volitions. However, we have no certain proof that God does will that bodies at rest remain at rest. So we cannot accept with certainty Descartes' first law, according to which the bodies at rest remain at rest, just like bodies in motion remain in motion. And in fact, we do have some reason to think that only motion requires a positive will from God. So it makes sense for us to endorse something different according to which only motion has a kind of force, but things at rest don't have any force like that. So this is a general outline of Malebranche's argument. And notably, this argument assumes that the laws of nature are the will of God. And Malebranche, in fact, explicitly attributes this position to Descartes himself. So we can take a look at the first quotation on this slide. So here, Malebranche says, let us go then as Descartes to the will of the creator. But if there is one single thing that I'm also wanted to stress in my talk, it is that Descartes didn't do that. But Descartes didn't go to the will of God. So in a sense, this argument of Malebranche against Descartes is really based on a mistaken conception of Descartes. It's based on a misreading. And in that sense, we can also treat this debate over the force of rest between Malebranche and Descartes as yet another consequence of the fundamental difference I have identified in my talk. So yeah, these are what I have to say. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks so much for now, and also thank you for being so precise and punctual with timing. Okay, we now move to the second part of the panel. Jason also has a handout which I'm going to reshare for everyone. There's a link in the chat. Jason.
Thanks, Emanuele. Thanks, Fanhao, for a wonderful paper. My paper will also be about 20 minutes, and it concerns later stage in accounts of the relation between the laws of nature and God. In particular, I'll try to clarify where Nietzsche thinks we must end up on laws of nature after the so-called death of God and why. I found that one really helpful way to understand where Nietzsche's views develop on laws of nature is to position him in relation to Spinoza, indeed following Nietzsche's own cues. And I'll mention just two such cues to begin, one more explicit and one more implicit. First, in the explicit case, you'll see in passage A in the handout that Nietzsche positions himself as a successor of Spinoza generally in this letter to a friend. Upon reading the historian of philosophy Kuno Fischer's extended treatment of Spinoza, Nietzsche proclaims that he's found his only predecessor. This is a relatively known text, so I won't dwell on it right now for the sake of time, even though I do think that it's still not well understood. And then second, in the relatively implicit case, Nietzsche develops a provocative and I think largely unknown response to Spinoza following his engagement with Fischer's text. So in that year and in the following year, you get an interesting move. Fischer had proposed in passage B that Spinoza's, quote, first thought was his equation of substance with God, with nature. And Nietzsche then suggests, possibly in dialogue with this point, with this claim by Fischer, that Spinoza's formula, God or nature, must be revised in favor of a, quote, chaos sive natura, chaos or nature. And it's this move, it's this locution that I'm going to try to shed some light upon now. In doing so, I have several goals. I'll just mention a couple of them. One is that I'm interested to shift the emphasis in some recent work by Nietzsche scholars like, for instance, Brian Leiter, who I would suggest does not take seriously enough Nietzsche's rejection of laws of nature, which he'll call in passage C a, quote, professed, if not entirely cogent skepticism. Another aim is that I'll also be interested, I also hope to put pressure on the notion of Spinoza as, quote, the most radical critic of anthropocentrism among the modern philosophers. As Yitzhak Melamed has proposed, I think he's right, of course, that Spinoza criticizes certain accounts of the laws of nature. So in passage D, for instance, Spinoza criticizes what Fanhao has helpfully called the voluntary choice conception. Spinoza writes there, I quote, "It's only because of the common people's power of understanding, a defect in their knowledge, that that God is described as a lawgiver or prince and called just, merciful, etc." End quote. For Spinoza, God is not a prince who lays down the laws of nature. Indeed, Spinoza will even go so far as to criticize, I quote again, men who prefer order to confusion, as if order were anything in nature more than a relation to our imagination. These men also say that God has created all things in order, and so unknowingly attribute imagination to God, end quote. In short, I think that Spinoza's bark here is crueler than his bite, and in order to suggest this, I'll move to a second section of the paper on Nietzsche's and Spinoza's naturalisms, which will help us understand what views they share and where they begin to part ways. So for many commentators, Nietzsche and Spinoza are both naturalists in some sense, but as has, I think, become clear over the past decades of philosophical discourse in particular, naturalism is said in many ways. The kind of naturalism I'll focus on today is of a substantive variety, you might say. Spinoza, for instance, namely endorses substantive naturalism, or the view that there's nothing but nature, in passages like those cited in E, where Spinoza rejects the idea that human beings stand outside of nature, furthermore dismisses any, quote, any notion of a, quote, dominion within a dominion. Were there multiple dominions, human beings could perhaps have one foot in and one foot out of nature, but this is likewise a possibility to be rejected. And similarly, in passages like those cited in E, Nietzsche is going to endorse a kind of substantive naturalism as well. He's going to criticize the idea that there's a transcendent world. He's going to call for us to, quote, translate humanity back into nature. In line with Spinoza's rejection of any human exceptionalism, Spinoza then suggests, Nietzsche then suggests that, quote, a person belongs to the whole, a person only is in the context of the whole, end quote. So here again, there's nothing but nature, that's it. But naturalism is still going to be a promiscuous term, even if we specify it as a kind of substantive naturalism in this case, because nature is still a promiscuous term. And the key point that I want to make today is that Spinoza endorses a profoundly gnomic naturalism, law-ordered naturalism. We can call it a rationalist substantive naturalism, which Nietzsche ultimately cannot accept. So Spinoza is going to suggest, namely, that there's nothing but nature, that is to say, one lawful order. As Spinoza puts it in passage F, all things are, quote, natural things which follow the common laws of nature. These must then guide our understanding of those things. Or as Michael Della Rocca glosses Spinoza, I quote, everything plays by the same rules. Nietzsche has to reject this rationalist substantive naturalism because Nietzsche rejects laws of nature. In two representative texts in G, for instance, Nietzsche decries the, quote, dominant mechanistic stupidity and mocks, quote, the conformity of nature to law, which you physicists are so proud of, end quote. Against Spinoza's rationalist brand of naturalism, then, Nietzsche rather embraces an anti-rationalist, indeed a chaotic alternative, what I'll call chaotic substantive naturalism, namely the view that there's nothing but nature, which is to say one unlawful disorder. So why does Nietzsche go this route? Why does he frame his view with reference to Spinoza, revising Spinoza's Deus sive natura, God or nature, in favor of a chaos sive natura, chaos or nature? And in order to answer that question now, I'll transition to section 3 on Spinoza's critique of anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism, which, long story short, I see Nietzsche to be drawing upon, doubling down on. So we have to get it on the table first. And I haven't framed things in these terms so far, but we've already seen that Spinoza rejects anthropocentrism. That is just the idea that humans occupy a central or even elevated status in or perhaps halfway outside of nature. Spinoza has to reject this as a straightforward consequence of his rationalist substantive naturalism. If there's nothing but one lawful order, then humans exist within that one order. And if humans exist within that one order in which everything plays by the same rules, then they can't be following their own rules exceptionally. And it's in this spirit that Spinoza criticizes in passage H those who, quote, believe that man disturbs rather than follows the order of nature. In other words, there's a natural order that includes and far exceeds humans. Most humans don't recognize this, however. They don't recognize their common status, and they instead imagine themselves exceptional. Insofar as they do that and then go on to interpret the world, they mistakenly engage in not only anthropocentrism, but furthermore often anthropomorphism, or thinking that existence is to be measured by alleged human existence. The measurement in question with respect to anthropomorphism involves now not just the erroneous evaluative gesture to consider human existence superior, special, and operating according to different rules and all that. That's the gesture essential to anthropocentrism, which should, I think, be considered upstream of anthropomorphism here. Downstream with anthropomorphism, we then furthermore make a descriptive gesture. We interpret non-human existence in alleged but ultimately limited human terms. And these all too human terms are limited now for two main reasons. First, they don't hold for us, they don't hold for humans. And second, they don't hold for non-humans either. Humans therefore make this dual mistake in descending from anthropocentrism to anthropomorphism when they imagine, for instance, that not only their doings, but even the world at large might be organized purposefully. Spinoza writes in this spirit of the foremost, quote, prejudice he wishes to undermine in the appendix to part 1 of the Ethics. I quote him in passage I, men commonly suppose that all natural things act as men do on account of an end. Indeed, they maintain as certain that God himself directs all things to some certain end. For they say that God has made all things for man, and man that he might worship God. Most humans, according to Spinoza, fall prey to teleological thinking according to which things are for something, that there are ends in the world, purposes. One reason for this kind of thinking, which is misguided for Spinoza, who thinks there's nothing but efficient causality and no final causality. One reason that people end up thinking this way, though, is that they think they set ends for themselves. But according to Spinoza, we have to rule out that kind of thinking insofar as we've ruled out any anthropomorphic conception of God too, insofar as if he doesn't have ends, possibly even ends that are aligned with human interest, we're not going to have ends either, namely because God's the only thing that exists. There are no ends in God, there are no ends in nature. There are no ends that we set by our free will either. According to Spinoza, we have to reject free will on the basis of determinism and necessitarianism that Spinoza argues for on the basis of his rationalism. And so all of this kind of teleological thinking is going to, according to Spinoza, quote, turn nature completely upside down for what is really a cause it considers an effect, and conversely. These are ideas and interestingly, even locutions that Nietzsche will later echo when he criticizes, quote, confusing cause and effect as the genuine destruction of reason and worse. Nietzsche seems to appreciate, namely, this accusation of confusion in Spinoza, which is not exactly transparent. Spinoza suggests that it's quote, manifest through itself in the appendix to part 1 of the Ethics, after he's put forward several of his most important metaphysical views, but it can be glossed. This set of moves and this kind of diagnosis can be glossed as follows. Take the example of my willing to drink water. I might think that I will to drink water and then subsequently drink water as a result. But for Spinoza, I confuse cause and effect here, because I rather think, according to Spinoza, that I will to drink water because I am drinking water. When I'm drinking water and don't understand the true causes of my drinking water, and instead lazily attribute this event to the freedom of will that I don't really have for Spinoza, then in that case, I take the effect to be the cause. Remember, that's the accusation that Spinoza leveled, that I'm taking the effect to be the cause. And with that sip of water, I will go on to point out that Nietzsche really likes all of this, but he thinks that Spinoza doesn't realize the can of worms that he's opened. And to clarify that point, that claim, I'll turn in a final main section, section 4, to Nietzsche's critique of anthropocentrism, anthropomorphism, and ultimately Spinoza. Spinoza's repudiation of divine providence, his repudiation of teleology, final causes, the notion of ends in the world, more broadly, is quite unforgiving. Errors abound as humans misinterpret themselves in elevating themselves and misinterpret the rest of nature as a result. They, quote, posit a nature so limited that they believe man to be its chief part, end quote. And they infer from this, humans infer from this, that the world revolves around them or works as they supposedly do. They ultimately take refuge in what Spinoza calls, I quote, a sanctuary of ignorance. This is a terminology that Nietzsche will reference a couple of times in notes dealing with Spinoza. But despite this proximity to Spinoza, Nietzsche ultimately stabs Spinoza in the back, as I put it, as I like to think about it, in a move that can be glossed as Nietzsche's, quote, revenge of Enlightenment, naturalism on Enlightenment, rationalism, to use a turn of phrase that Robert Brandom offers in a paper on Nietzsche and genealogy. And to see Nietzsche, to understand how Nietzsche might be getting this kind of revenge, it's worth emphasizing the initial proximity of his critique of anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism to Spinoza. So compare, for instance, how Spinoza derides humans' view of themselves as the, quote, chief part of nature, with how Nietzsche mocks this figure he calls in passage J, the realist. Nietzsche writes there in The Gay Science, before you alone, reality stands unveiled, and you yourselves are perhaps the best part of it. Nietzsche continues, but aren't you two, in your unveiled condition, still most passionate and dark creatures compared to fish, end quote. Humans are here imagining themselves to occupy some preeminent position, while Nietzsche suggests a comparison with marine life, again mocking the idea that humans reside in some allegedly exclusive human heights, proposing instead that humans might just as well rather inhabit the depths of the earth. Nietzsche goes on to challenge the anthropocentric, anthropomorphizing interpreter of nature. I quote, you still carry around valuations of things that originate in the passions and loves of former centuries. In every experience, in every sense impression, there is a piece of this old love and some fantasy, some prejudice, some irrationality, some ignorance. Nietzsche's references here to Prejudice and ignorance, again, strongly echo Spinoza. As previously, humans are here carried away by their self-flattering biases. Nietzsche's injunction, as reads, I quote again, subtract just once the phantasm and whole human contribution from it, you sober ones. If you could forget all of your humanity and animality, end quote. Like Spinoza, Nietzsche highlights what are commonly the limits of our human ways of seeing the world, which Nietzsche reminds us are in fact equally animalistic ways of seeing the world in passages like this in the Gay Science, yeah. But Nietzsche arrives via this line of thinking at a surprising place. For Spinoza, we should eliminate our habit of overestimating ourselves and consequently misinterpreting nature precisely in order to grasp what turns out to be its perfectly rational character. Nature may not be oriented around ends with final causes, but nature is still organized in efficient causal terms, oriented around efficient causality with God as the efficient cause of all things. So here's now the twist. Nietzsche sees no reason to assume such a stable object of study, any kind of gnomic nature, even if he's pleased that it has at least been stripped of ends. So Nietzsche basically asks now, why, having dismissed final causes, not proceed through the other three causes too? And with no answer to this question forthcoming, and I think this is the key move, a kind of negative move here, Nietzsche accuses rationalist substantive naturalism itself of anthropomorphism, leaving him at his chaotic alternative, this chaotic substantive naturalism. Nietzsche therefore concludes the train of thought I was just exploring under J. I quote, there's no reality for us. That's, of course, the royal we here, and not for you either, end quote. In other words, grasping nature without human delusion means seeing that it's not limited to any bounds whatsoever, teleological or otherwise. There's no such there in the sense that there's nothing stable to point to, nothing defined by order whose lawful movements we might trace, so nothing definite, period. Nietzsche succinctly suggests, quote, contra Spinoza and his causalism here in notebooks, and I quote from passage L, that the belief in causae or causes falls with the belief in tele or ends, end quote. For Nietzsche in such radical passages, not only does teleological thinking erroneously inject human rumor into nature, but so does thinking in terms of the causal law that every effect has its cause, perhaps also the law that every cause has its effect. These are mere artifacts of a humane way of seeing things that, for instance, seeks comfort in regularity, which would give us a means to satisfy what Nietzsche derisively calls our, quote, causal instinct. This is the instinct to explain things and do away with our anxiety about them. In this way, Nietzsche thinks he can carry forward Spinoza's critical line, major step, as he hopes in passage L, not just to, quote, naturalize humanity, but also to, quote, completely de-deify nature. Nietzsche aims, and this is arguably a way to understand the whole program really, at the, quote, dehumanization of nature. That's going to secure him a, quote, pure concept of nature. And he wants with that to pursue the, quote, renaturalization of humanity. So on the basis of this pure concept of nature, he wants to renaturalize humanity, but he has to get the right concept of nature in order to do that. Let's look at each element of this passage, condensing, I suspect, a great deal of Nietzsche's program. With regards to its first element, the dehumanization of nature is, of course, what comes out of the critique of the anthropocentrism that informs anthropomorphism. Dehumanizing nature might sound like a bad thing, but for Nietzsche, it's about getting rid of, overcoming our harmful prejudices. With regards to the middle portion of the passage now in L there, the program, Nietzsche is so wary of missing the pure concept of nature because of our prejudices that he's laid out, such that he's going to put here nature in scare quotes. He has to tread lightly because nature is commonly reified, conceived of in mistaken, all too human terms. As even when a philosopher like Spinoza criticizes others for their anthropomorphic tendencies, Spinoza will himself fall into the kind of error that he's criticizing, missing out on this allegedly pure concept of nature and rather imagining it to be characterized by a lawful order. So I quote Nietzsche. According to Nietzsche, the old God still lives in Spinoza, namely the God who orders existence, who is ultimately a kind of lawgiver. Despite Spinoza's efforts, he's fallen into that trap, according to Nietzsche. Finally, with regards to the final portion of the programmatic passage in L, so with regards to the renaturalization of humanity, one reason I'm interested in all of these issues is that this whole case for a chaotic substantive naturalism is, I think, going to feed into the ethical program that Nietzsche develops in a really important way. And when Nietzsche develops that ethical program in certain passages, he'll, for instance, position himself opposite, but I think on exactly the same spectrum as Spinoza. For instance, in the following appeal, this is also from Notebooks, I quote passage M, where he writes, "No more joy in certainty, but rather in uncertainty. No more cause and effect," again in scare quotes, "but rather the continually creative." In each case, I see Nietzsche opposing himself to Spinoza, who wants joy and certainty, who wants cause and effect, where Nietzsche wants uncertainty and this continually creative, this notion of the continually creative that would then be chaotic in character. So while Nietzsche is, like Spinoza, interested in becoming what we are within nature as we understand it better, that understanding is certainly not an end in itself for Nietzsche. And furthermore, what's understood is in any case of another nature, to put it that way. Nietzsche is then going to suggest, for instance, in the prologue to Zarathustra, I quote again from M, "One must have chaos in one to give birth to a dancing star," end quote. The chaotic world, in other words, is supposed to be the more liberatory one, according to Nietzsche, because it's lawless. That's supposedly going to allow for the more radical self-creation and self-expression that Nietzsche aims at. That dimension, that ethical dimension of Nietzsche's thinking, I think deserves more discussion than I can provide today, but I hope that I've at least reconstructed some of the ideas that feed into Nietzsche's ethics here, in a way that would allow us to discuss several aspects of his thought in the Q&A now. I hope that I've illuminated Nietzsche's relation to Spinoza along the way, and perhaps also shown some of the limitations of Spinoza's critique of anthropocentrism and ultimately anthropomorphism, at least as Nietzsche reads Spinoza, and that's something I'd be interested in discussing in Q&A in particular, among other things. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you so much, Fanhao. And I'm sure we'll have a really rich Q&A. I'm going to invite everyone to make themselves visible if they're comfortable with that, just so that we feel more welcoming. I'm going to stop the registration.